Welcome back. We are working on Unit 2, talking about the art historical information for Unit 2. And for this particular unit, I'm going to cover a little extra beyond that first three-part lecture on ancient civilizations. I felt it's really, students had a hard time understanding how we went from like that ancient Egyptian and ancient Mesopotamian art and culture and type of societies, how we went from that to the classical world. And I think that story is pretty complex. So this is a separate lecture that will kind of address this question. This will be, of my art historical lectures, probably the most historical, with not much time spent on actual art historical discussion, but more just the history. But I'm hoping that this will be done in just one part rather than a two-parter. And so, like I said, this is kind of about how we went from the end of the late Bronze Age, how we went from this period where Mesopotamian civilization was not at its height, but Egyptian civilization was, but there were other powers in the world. The world of the late Bronze Age was dominated by Egypt and an empire to the north known as the Hittites. So here we have some examples to show you who they were, and if you are interested in finding out who these people were, and what this world was like at the late Bronze Age, there are tons of videos on the playlist for this unit that really kind of give you a lot of detail about this. But the main thing to know is that the Egyptians were ascendant, like under Ramses II. They'd spread the Egyptian empire far into the Levant and probably as wide as it ever was. But the Hittites were also an extremely powerful group. And at the same time, the Assyrians were becoming more dominant. They pretty much dominated all of what was used to be called Mesopotamia. Babylon was not nearly as powerful at this time. At the same time, there was something else developing in the Aegean. There were these civilizations in the parts of the Mediterranean that we now call Crete and Greece, and some of these islands in between Crete and Greece, the islands on the edge of Turkey, the islands on the edge of Greece, Cyprus, and some other major islands. There were these different cultures that were developing that were kind of interrelated, and they were a major part of this kind of ecosystem of this late Bronze Age world. Most notably, they were an important part of the trade because these were seafaring people, and they produced wine and they produced olive oil, and they traded. And the Mediterranean was kind of like the major shipping highway of the late Bronze Age. So it was these people, the Minoans, such as this artwork here and this artwork, and the Mycenaeans. And by the way, these names are names that we gave to these people later. These people were the kind of primary conduit between the Hittite, Assyrian, and Egyptian empires, and conduit between the smaller kingdoms that were in between, especially like the kingdoms of the Levant on the coasts of what is now Israel and Syria. Okay. And something happened around 1200 to 1100 BCE. This whole system collapsed, and we don't exactly know why. There are a lot of great videos that talk about how this happened and some of the theories as to why this happened. But what we do know is that it collapsed. The Egyptians had to basically retreat, and their kingdom became much smaller. The Hittites pretty much disappeared entirely. The Assyrians also, their kingdom became much smaller, and a lot of the major cities of this time period were abandoned. Many, we have examples of them. We have evidence that they were destroyed. Some clearly destroyed by fire, some clearly destroyed by invasion, some possibly destroyed by earthquake. And there was just a general abandonment of the large cities of the coast and a lot of movement inlands. And all kinds of things happened. But basically, it was like civilization ended. And there was this period where there was not much in the way of development of political of any size. All politics was local, it was small, it was city-states and small kingdoms. But the Assyrians kind of held on to this empire idea, and by about 800 BCE, we see the development of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And we move into this kind of what I would call the Axial Age, or you might call the early Iron Age. This period, and some people also might refer to it as the Archaic period. And this is a period where we have a return dominance of this idea of empire. And the Assyrians were truly strong advocates of that. I'm going to pause a second to talk a little bit about the art right now when we talk about the Assyrians, because we're going to be talking about the Dying Lioness multiple times. We're going to be covering it when we talk about relief. It's a form of low relief or bas relief. We're going to be talking about it when we talk about the relationship of power and art. So just kind of make sure that you know this work. It is a carving on a wall. It's part of what's called a frieze, which is a long series of relief carvings, and it was in the palace of Ashurbanipal, who was one of the king of kings of the Assyrians. So make sure that you know the Ashurbanipal reliefs, and that you know the Dying Lioness specifically, well, because it will come up. At a certain point, the Assyrians kind of lost power, and the Neo-Babylonians. Babylon was a city, if you remember from our earlier lecture, a city founded by the Amorites, although it may have existed earlier as an Akkadian or Sumerian city, but it was basically an Amorite city. But by this point, I believe it was a Chaldean city. But all of these different cultures are kind of intermingled, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire was this new force, and for a while they kind of rivaled and then took over what the Assyrians had achieved. The Assyrian Empire, hold on a second, let's go back. The Assyrian Empire had, at one point, they had spread all the way into Greece, or into Egypt. So they were a pretty dominant force, but they did not hold Egypt. Very few people had by this point. And then the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was them being invaded and taken over by the Persian Empire. And very quickly, the Persian Empire became the most successful, most professional run empire the world has seen. They were, and their success as empire builders was primarily due to the fact that they were not control freaks. Unlike the Assyrians, who messed around with the people they controlled a lot, like moved populations and had a lot of high expectations in terms of tributes. The Persians mostly allowed self-rule wherever they could, and if people were willing to collaborate with them, then they were willing to mostly leave those peoples alone, and that the Persians focused primarily on the fast communication and movement of troops through the empire, and the fast movement of goods through the empire, and through that they kind of they had a very successful empire. And so at the time that we run into the Greek city-states, the primary empire of the world, the primary political force of the world, are the Persians. All right, we're almost done. I got about a minute left. So the main thing I want to say is, on the periphery of the Persian Empire, though, there was developing this new thing, which we say are the classical Greeks. The Greeks had continued from that culture, remember this, continued from these cultures, the Minoan, the Mycenaean, and even in some ways the Cycladic cultures, had built upon it after the Bronze Age collapse. And during this Archaic period, they had slowly come up with a new kind of culture, which we call Greek. And you can see that they're both quite willing to be inheritors of traditions of other parts of the world, like the Egyptians and the Assyrians, and Mesopotamians, but they were finding their own new version of it. And we see this especially in the development of their ceramics, where, like, here's a